This is an interview with Roberta Rager of Somerset Township, Somerset County, Pennsylvania. Following the crash of Flight 93 on September 11, 2001, Bert responded as a volunteer registered nurse with the American Red Cross. She was assigned to the Family Assistance Center at Seven Springs, where she provided health services to Flight 93 family members. This interview is being conducted on August 29, 2012 at the Rager home in Somerset Township. The interviewer is Kathy Schaefer, representing the Oral History Project of the Flight 93 National Memorial. Bert, would you tell me how old you are?
I just turned 69 this month.
Happy birthday, then.
Thank you.
And where do you live?
In Whispering Pines in Somerset Township, Somerset County.
Are you a lifelong resident of Somerset County?
Heavens no, I was born and reared in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. I spent about 20 years back and forth to Florida, and now we're what they call snowbirds. Mm-hmm. And we moved out here because they're one-story residence, and I could no longer do the steps. But we love it.
And would you tell me about your education?
I finished high school in 1961. Like a lot of us, I started nursing school and decided to quit to get married. After my children were in school, I went back and got my nursing associate degree at Polk Community College in Winter Haven, Florida. Worked in a small hospital for a couple years. And then we came back to the Johnstown area, and I went to work with Red Cross. I started out on the blood mobiles, which was really a fun experience, but it got to be a little boring, and I thought it was time to do something different. We started an apheresis project. I moved into that and eventually became nursing director.
And that was all in Johnstown?
That was all in Johnstown at the American Red Cross. I then left there, went in 84, went back to Florida. I worked in the same little hospital for about a year and a half. And then I went with Florida Blood Services out of Orlando, Florida, and worked there for a while. I quit there, opened my own little needlework store for a short while. Because of personal difficulties, I had to close it and leave, came back. Looking somewhere east of the Mississippi, ran into an old classmate, and I've been here for the last 21 years. He convinced me I should marry him and stay, and it was not someone I ever dreamed I would marry. So I've been retired. Well, actually, I quit working in 1993. And when my husband retired is when we decided to go back and forth every 6 months.
From Florida to Pennsylvania?
From Florida to Pennsylvania. And then we moved from Johnstown out to here.
So you're a registered nurse?
I am a registered nurse.
And I know that you also have in your resume volunteer experience with the American Red Cross. Could you tell me about that, Bert?
I started doing the volunteer with the American Red Cross while I was a paid employee. Back in the late 70s, paid staff members could go out on a 2-week assignment with salary
for a disaster?
To disaster areas anywhere in the United States. I understand it's since changed. But it was a nice thing to be able to do because you could go volunteer, you were still getting your salary, and hopefully someone back at the office was keeping your work up to date. But at that time I wasn't nursing director, so it was easier to get away. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I loved working the disaster aspect of it. I've been out to the Midwest. I think that was in 1983 for the floods out there. My husband and I were both down on the Gulf Coast, not for Katrina, but prior to that. I have been to Puerto Rico, which was a totally social difference, to see the barrios and the way some of the people there lived, and yet to see the elaborate, expensive La Playas that a lot of European people bought and would come vacation.
Was that also a natural disaster?
It was flooding. So it's provided me with a lot of experience, as well as I feel helping many, many, many people, from the poorest to the richest. And I think that's what counts. The American Red Cross doesn't look at your income to say, well, gee, we'll give you some help. It's strictly on what did you lose, what do you need, and emergency basis, not something that's going to take you on for the next 10 years. Preferably to get over the first 3 days till you can get back on your feet a little bit. And yet some things are extended. I mean, if you need an apartment, we would look at trying to help there. And it was clothing, it was food, it was diapers for the babies.
Immediate needs.
Immediate needs. And that was the point. It was immediate emergency needs. When Flight 93 went down, we were living in Richland Township in Johnstown. And at the time we thought, listening to everything afterward, that the plane had come in basically over where our house was. I understand now it really came in further south than that. But I got a phone call from Pat Avini, who was our volunteer coordinator at the chapter.
And that was, now we're talking about September 11th.
This is September 11th,
2001.
2001, when Flight 93 went down. And her first comment was, do you have your suitcase packed? Well, of course, I knew why Pat would call me, but why would I have my suitcase packed? And she said, Bert, don't you have your television on? Obviously, I didn't. I turned it on, and I was just aghast at everything at New York, at Washington, D.C., and at Shanksville.
So the plane had already crashed?
It had already crashed. It was down. My first comment was, while I'm packing my suitcase, but I have to find my mother. And Pat said, where's your mother? I said, she's on a bus trip to Washington, D.C. I eventually found her, and she was fine. And the great bus driver got them out of town. She said later they saw the smoke from the Pentagon. But it was a strange answer, I have to find mother. Hal was at a neighbor's, he heard it, he came home. And then we, of course, checked in with Pat and drove to Shanksville. We first went down to the PBS building, which was just on the knoll above the impact site. It was anticlimactic. There was no plane. There were no big pieces of plane. There was
see any
there was
debris.
nothing to see. It was just this huge hole. Now, as you began to really, really look, you could see little bits of debris here and there. But nothing that was outstanding. And I think everybody there looked at each other and said, this doesn't look like a plane wreck. Well, finding out later what had happened and how far it had buried itself, it was just bizarre. It was really bizarre.
Do you know what time of the day you arrived?
I want to say about 11 o'clock. I don't remember what time the plane went down exactly.
10:03 was the time of the crash.
It must have been more like 11:30, because it was about an hour and a half after it
Okay.
crashed.
And what sort of activity was there at that point?
The first responders were showing up. Of course, some of them were already there. They were down at the crash site, some of them already in their white cover clothing. They were setting up a tent for the media. They were trying to decide actually where headquarters was going to be. It was a very beginning process, although the local responders, and I mean, the firemen, the EMS people from the Shanksville area, from the Somerset County area, as well as the Red Cross volunteers. And there weren't a lot of the Red Cross volunteers that day. It wasn't something that we would normally go to en masse because there were no survivors. So it was a really organizational type time. They asked my husband if he would stay there with the tent and so on and do logistics. The tent, the feeding, cars.
Was he established as a volunteer?
Yes, he was. I'm sorry. He had
That's
already
fine.
been out with me for other volunteer
Okay.
assignments. And my nursing officer asked if I would go out to the Family Assistance Center out at Seven Springs and get things ready because that's where they were bringing the family members into.
That came together very quickly.
It did.
I mean, to make a decision that Seven Springs would be the location.
United Airlines was making a lot of the decisions. This was a disaster that was spearheaded by the airlines. It was an aircraft disaster, not a natural disaster. So they spearheaded a lot of it. Of course, the feds were in, FEMA was there, the FT, Federal Traffic and whatever.
Or FAA.
The FFA. They were housed in the building. The only people we had out at Seven Springs were a couple nursing volunteers and mental health. It wasn't a place where we needed a mass amount of Red Cross volunteers. We were in the upstairs where Wooley's ski den used to be. Mm-hmm. All of the federal agencies were downstairs from us. And it did go together fast. They looked around, they being, I think it was United Airlines, and said, where can we put up this many people that would be accessible to the site, there would be a decent place for them to stay, and yet we could have access to them. And the nearest place was Seven Springs. So yeah, it went together very fast. It's amazing how fast disaster operations can go together because everybody has done their preparatory work. Individually, together.
Did you go to Seven Springs that day?
I went to Seven Springs that afternoon. None of the family members were there before I got there. We set up the big room that had been the ski store. And it was John, heaven help me, my memory with names is terrible.
John Weaver?
Yes.
John Ream? I know both of those
John
gentlemen.
Weaver.
Weaver.
Set up our little desks and got it ready for the family members to come in. It was a place for the members to come and gather, to talk to each other, to share their thoughts, to get out of their motel rooms. It's obviously a nice place at Seven Springs. They wanted them to have a nice environment. They even opened the Alpine slide for them and for the staff people just to get a break. So we were there if they needed us. We didn't intrude. We didn't go looking for them. Flowers that came in from the schools and the organizations around were just outstanding. Those were all kept in that room for the family members. The signs, I remember one morning, the one side of the building was all glass. And I walked in one morning, and John was already there, and he said, Bert, turn and look out the window. Some of the school kids had done a banner on white butcher paper, and they put it up the night before and stretched it across the window. Well, that morning, it was yellow, and it looked like stained glass. It was just, what a feeling for these school children to think of these families. And I think we both stood there a little teary-eyed about it. And the family members who came in early that morning were the same way. I mean, they would walk in and say, oh my goodness.
And that was the sunlight.
It was the sunlight coming through the paper, and it was turning it yellow. Mm-hmm. But it was white butcher paper. I think you run into experiences like that. I was there if the family members had coughs.
You were dealing with their physical needs?
Just their physical needs. John would take care of their emotional needs. Behind us in a closed-in, tented-like areas where they were doing the DNA sampling.
Okay.
They were asking the family members to bring in toothbrushes, hairbrushes, anything that might have a DNA particle on it, and they were drawing blood from family members. So the people were in and out doing that also. And sometimes when they left there, they were a little shaky. Not everybody likes their blood drawn. But we had one family that Grandpa flew in from California. And Grandpa had some cardiac problems and some pulmonary problems. Nothing that would prevent him from flying. I mean, he was in decent shape. But he had forgotten all of his meds. Fortunately, because of the structure with the Red Cross, the name, his medications were all through the VA. I was able to contact the local VA, have them contact California, get approval for a 2-week supply of his meds, and then we sent a courier down to pick them up. So Granddad was great until he could get somebody to ship all of his here. But you ran into things like that. People packed so fast, and they weren't thinking about themselves. You know, the stress was there, the need to get here as fast as they felt they could, to be with their other family members. And it was things like that. One family had a young boy who was probably 2-3 years old, who came down with a cold. You know, what could we do for him? Well, we could get him across the counter, or we could call. The Red Cross always has a physician who signs off on their procedures and protocol for nursing. He was always available for us to get in touch with him. If we needed something and didn't have a local doctor, so we could get in touch with him for something that was a little more, there went my brain again.
Well, a prescription.
A prescription, and then I'm trying to say a little more, forget it, a prescription rather than over the counter. So we had backup like that. We could take care of things like that. We would get, you know, brushed knuckles, or somebody would fall. We didn't really do hands-on first aid. That wasn't our purpose. Our purpose was to take care of their physical needs. But if someone fell down and scraped their knee, I mean, I would certainly look at it, give them things to wipe it off with, and make sure it was not something they needed to go to the hospital for. Mm-hmm. That pretty much was what our days were. And if I felt someone came in with, they wanted a Band-Aid, but you could read through their affect that they needed someone to really talk to, I would call John over and let him go off in a corner with them. If he saw someone that he felt had some physical needs, maybe they were coughing a little too much, then he would send them to me. All the buses that took them out to the crash site, to the memorial, when...
This would have been now...
This is several days later.
The first bus would have been the following Monday.
Golly, was that long? You know, the time went so fast. We had, I think it was 5 buses. And we bused them from there at Seven Springs out to the memorial when Laura Bush came in.
Yes, that would have been Monday.
And, you know, made sure they got on their buses. Each bus had a nurse, a volunteer nurse assigned to it. They were supposed to stay with the bus from the time it left Seven Springs until it got back. I'm afraid that some of the volunteer nurses ran into a situation they hadn't planned on because they were asked to do something other than just be right there with their people. And, you know, as always, if they're not somebody who volunteers all the time and they were community nurses, things break down. But we got it straightened out.
Are you able to say what they were asked to do?
Yes, they were asked to set up chairs.
For the ceremony?
For the ceremony.
Okay.
Okay. I can't say that everybody with Red Cross was good to work with. Mm-hmm. We had a great thing going, and then someone from on up the line came in, and that's where the breakdown went, because they didn't understand the concept. I mean, I would have known if somebody looked at me and said, "Can you help set up chairs?" Well, yeah, that's part of making everybody comfortable. But the family members never knew it was going on. I mean, it was kept away from them, so it was fine. But, you know, we were there for them when they were left. I didn't go out to the memorial because I had volunteer nurses from the local area that I felt really wanted to go. And I let them have the experience. I didn't go out to this memorial until later on. I mean, it was probably several years before I went back out. And my husband and I went out and looked at it. It was before they started doing all the building and putting the wall up and everything. They had the chicken wire fences up with people putting memorials on, and you could look out over. It was a different view than we had the first day.
Oh, yeah, the perspective would have been.
So I had to acclimate myself to the different perspective and say, okay, let's see. We were up there, and we were looking. I think the fact that they have a memorial is outstanding. I think it's something that's necessary. I think we don't know exactly what happened on that plane. Obviously, some of them at least decided they weren't going to let this happen, whatever this was. And they had cell phones, so they had an idea what this was. God had to have been with them. All the places they could have hit, they went down in a barren field. And all of them on that plane, other than the terrorists, were yes, indeed, heroes. I do think they're spending entirely too much money
to complete the memorial.
to complete the memorial. I don't think a memorial needs that much money. I like what they've done. I like the wall. I think that's impressive.
The wall of names.
The wall of names. But some of the rest of it, I mean, it's just too much money to spend on something like that when we need it elsewhere. We can only do so much for the family members who are remaining. To give them a place to go and to remember and to grieve, I think is necessary. But to that expense, I don't. It was not an easy, in fact, it was the most difficult assignment I had ever been on. And I ended up being the one that needed John in mental health. We never know what the ripple effect is going to be from a disaster, whether it be mankind or natural disaster. I lost my grandson in 1999.
I'm sorry.
Didn't think about it. Didn't really connect the two until we were into the second week. And finally one day I looked at John and said, we need to go talk. And dear John said, I've known it was coming. He said, I don't know what your problem is. He said, but I can see it. So we went outside and found a little corner and we talked. And, we talked about the grieving process and how long it should be. And he said, don't believe anything you read. He said, it's not 2 years, it's not 7 years, it's a lifetime. And, as always, when you're dealing with a large number of people, you get some who want to push the boundaries. They want a little more than people are able to give them. You get people who really have no business, who want what the immediate survivors got. And I think that started to eat on me a little bit. And then I started to think of, having lost a grandson, and it's like, who did this for him? Now, it's not nearly the same thing. The child was in a car with 6 teenagers going too fast. But it just all seems to hit. And I realized that after that disaster, it was time for me to quit. I had been with Red Cross cumulatively 25 years.
That's quite a long time.
It was a great career. I loved blood services. I loved the volunteer aspect. When I came back up here in 1991, I went back to Red Cross. Well, there's only, one nursing director position available. But they were creating a new job, training the volunteer RNs to do health histories at the blood donor stations when they first come in to donate. So they needed someone who would go out in the entire area that we covered to train the volunteer RNs. Then after a couple of years, they cut that program. Then I decided it was just time to quit.
So you took on that role?
I took on that role.
Came back in 91?
In 91. And my husband went with me sometimes. He would drive and sit in the car and do his crossword puzzle. But I was beginning to have problems driving and staying awake, so it was time to quit that too. But I thoroughly enjoyed that as much as anything else. I mean, to see all the volunteer nurses in the region who came out to work with blood services. So from disaster to paid staff, to working with the chapter, to the blood region, it was kind of a really varied career. But, you know, September 2001 will be with me always. And some of the family members I remember, some of them I won't remember their names, but I remember their faces.
Are you able to tell me the ones that you do remember?
Do you know, I don't at this point remember any of the names.
That's fine.
Until I see them in print.
Uh-huh.
And then I'll see them in print and I'll think, okay, yeah, that was so-and-so. And, you know, I can put some names with faces in. My memory's going. But I think I can remember names from other disasters better than I can that one. It's just like, it was a cumulative group of survivors. And I was used to dealing with, not really the survivors, the families of those we lost. You know, in other disasters you actually had survivors who were impacted by the natural disaster, who lost their homes. In this one you had people who lost family members. So it became more a cohesive group. And obviously if you look back over the years and what's going on with that group, they definitely have become very much a cohesive group.
Oh,
You know,
yes.
some of them are still working very, very hard together. Some of them have gone on and changed their lives. They've gone on with their lives. Some of them never going to. You know, they're not going to make major changes. They're going to live the lives they have always lived. They're going to remember the people who died. We had one fellow that, I don't remember where he was from, and I can't remember his name. If I saw his picture, his sister's name, I would remember it. But she was in from Hawaii and was flying back home from New Jersey. And he came in to the Family Assistance Center and wanted to know if he could set up a little memorial table for her with some leis and some Hawaiian flowers and so on. And he always wore a Hawaiian shirt. That was his own little personal remembrance of his sister, was this gaudy, bright-colored Hawaiian shirt, and yet it was appropriate.
I would think that would have to be Georgine Corrigan's.
You're right.
She has two brothers.
He was never in black. You know, he was never somber and upset. He remembered her life. He commemorated her life. And it was really, there were times when you'd be tired and whatnot, and you'd think, oh boy, here he comes again, because you knew he was going to pick you up whether he wanted to or not. He would have something new he wanted to do, you know, whatever. I know that United Airlines gave some of the family members, and I don't know exactly what their breakdown was, some money right up front. There were people who were second and third cousins who thought they ought to get in on the act. But United Airlines had a good handle on things. Food was served for the staff downstairs where all the federal agencies were. We all had different badges, you know.
Your identification.
Identifying what areas we could and could not get into. And if you didn't have the right identifying badge, you didn't get to eat. Now, those who were out at Red Cross headquarters,
which was a local church.
It was a local church out by the airport.
That's where your husband would have been?
He was stationed out there.
Okay.
And they ate out there. The ones who ate at Seven Springs were the staff members who were there, and there's just a few of us. But it was amazing how fast they put it together, how well they worked with it, how the family members. I never looked at the family members and saw them actually totally break down and lose it. I'm sure they did it in their rooms. But they were out and around, they weren't. I mean, you knew they were grieving, but it was an upbeat way. They were glad to be here. They were grateful to be here. and that they could go out to the memorial. There were some of them. One young family went home. I think they took an uncle or someone home, and felt like their son had not really come to grips with his uncle's death. It was the young man had lost his son. The young man had lost his brother.
Okay.
The son of the family had lost his uncle, and they felt like he really hadn't grasped that yet. So they came back, and there was no problem with them coming back. I mean, they could go home for a day or two and come back as often as they wanted.
I think there were families that did that.
There were.
I'm going to ask you to pause for a moment. Bert, could I ask you a few questions about some of the things that you've shared?
Absolutely.
Do you recall on September 14th, which was the Friday after, there was a large event planned at the Somerset County Courthouse. It was a candlelight vigil to take place on the steps of the courthouse. Governor Ridge spoke at this event, and I know that there were Red Cross volunteers or staff that came with some family members who had already come into the area and attended that. Do you recall, or did you attend?
Yes and yes.
Okay. Could you tell me your memories of that evening?
Again, we had buses that they brought out to Seven Springs for the family members who wanted to attend the vigil. It was, I mean, the family members, it was guaranteed that they got the front seats, the closer to Governor Ridge and had good spots and so on. The townspeople were just amazing. If you looked up and down the street in both directions, on Center Avenue, is that Main Street that crosses there?
North Center and Union.
Union. It was, I mean, for a block in all four directions, it was packed. I mean, the community, the Somerset community, came out in droves in many, many, many ways for those family members. But you looked around and you saw of course we knew who the family members were. So then you saw all these other people that you knew were just community people who didn't know them, who had never seen them, and yet they would realize who family members were. They would walk up to them and simply say, "I'm sorry," and leave. They didn't prolong a conversation. I got myself in not a lot of trouble, but there was a sidewalk coming in from each side to the bottom of the steps. It was nice and clear. So I kind of stepped out of the grass, and then this man with his thing in his ear came by and said, "Would you mind stepping off the sidewalk? We need to keep this clear for the governor." And I went, "Oh, shoot." That was a Secret Service man. At that point, it began to dawn on us who were out there. Ridge was going somewhere other than governor of the state of Pennsylvania when they assigned him Secret Service personnel. And I remember we discussed it that evening. Did you see the guys with the earphones? Mm-hmm. Does the governor always get that? No. And of course then he went on to become
Secretary of Homeland Security.
Secretary of Homeland Security. And I think at that point it was already decided that that's the position he was going to move into. And that's rather obvious. I mean, he was here. He was the head politician in the state. As far as political power goes, he was the one who was the closest to it, to the family members, to what happened, to the response. But it was just funny, I mean, being told to very politely, very firmly, "Would you please step back off the sidewalk?" And then you see his earphone and the curly thing going down under his collar, and I felt like I just fallen into the earth.
Do you remember anything else about that evening or the service?
I remember some of the service, not all of it. I think we were all just so taken with it. It seemed to be over before it even began. I can remember thinking, wow, and looking at my watch and not realizing how long we had been literally standing there, not sitting, but standing. And I remember looking for my husband in the crowd because, he'd come in from a different direction. But we, of course, went back to the buses to make sure that the people got on the buses they came out on, and we had assigned them bus numbers. And it was quite a while before all the family members got back to their buses. And they came back saying, gee, we didn't mean to hold the buses up so long, but these school children wanted to talk to us, or this couple from Shanksville just wanted to tell us how sorry they were. So, the fact that they were there that long was terrific. It was so positive for them.
Do you recall the Steelers being present? They arrived
Yes.
also because their games were canceled.
They were late. I do think they were late. I think we waited a little while then, but I remember them coming. I'd forgotten all about it. Yeah, and even that, these family members were from all over the United States. It's not like they were all Pennsylvanians. In fact, I don't know if any of them were.
Well, Lorraine Bay, the flight attendant, she was born in Pennsylvania. Debbie Welsh, was she born in Pennsylvania? Lunaki. There were a few people with ties, definitely, to Pennsylvania, but primarily they were...
This is not where they were living.
The flight was Newark to San Francisco, so primarily these folks were...
And they were living on the two different sides of the country.
The coasts, yes.
And they could not get over the empathy, the sympathy, and the understanding from the people of Somerset County. And, as things...
It was a positive experience.
Oh, it was very positive. It was very, very positive. This community just came through for them. Absolutely came through for them in ways they never anticipated. From the flowers to the pictures, to the, quote, stained glass banner across the window. There were even some pictures, photographs, that people would bring in and say, may we lay these out on the table. They were pictures of this crash site. And if any of the family members want them, they're welcome to take them. Little things keep cropping up that I had forgotten about over the years. I stayed at Seven Springs for about a week and a half.
So you were overnight?
Oh, I was overnight. I was there 24/7.
Were you the lead nurse in this area of their physical health?
No, there was another, her title was nursing officer, and she was out at headquarters at the church.
Do you recall her name?
No, if you mentioned, I would know it again.
I don't know if I know it, but that's all right.
She drove me crazy, though. I get a phone call from her every day. Are you done yet? You ready to wrap it up? Well, your husband's ready for supper. Well, tell him to go eat. For some reason, he charmed her, and she checked on me every day to see if I was ready to go eat with him. And it was really kind of cute because she was a much older woman. But she was at headquarters, Red Cross headquarters, and I was the nursing coordinator out at Seven Springs.
Okay.
She came out to visit, I think, once or twice. And we determined it was not handicap friendly out there.
Yes, and that would have been an issue. There were family members that had special needs.
They had special needs, and they needed wheelchairs, and they had to come out around, from the front parking lot around the side, because it really was not, absolutely not, handicap friendly. And I think that went into her report, which is good, not just for that disaster, but also for Seven Springs, for their day-to-day operations. But she was a good one to work with. And then they had some more family members come in, and they needed rooms. So they shifted some of us from Red Cross way, way up on top of the hill into some condominiums. And I remember the first night I had to go up there. I wasn't sure where I was going, and the fog had set in. And it was a twisty, turny road going up to those condos. And I only spent 2 or 3 nights there. And by then we were starting to wind down. We stayed until the last family members went home.
Now there was a second memorial service. That would have been Thursday. The first one was the 17th. The second one was the 20th. And the FBI continued to work at the site till I think maybe the 23rd. I'm not sure if that's exactly
I
the
think
date.
I think the federal agencies were there much longer than we were. Because once the family members started to go home and everything was quieting down, it was time for us to, quote, pack our tents and go home. Because our job had been to take care of the family members.
Yes.
We weren't involved in the other aspect of it. So they were there much longer than we were. And I came home before my husband because he had to start closing down operations. He had to get...
Well, he had the logistics.
He had to get the cars back where they belonged, the rental cars that we all used. He had to get the tents back where they belonged that had been set up for the media because it was hot. Mm-hmm. He had to get the porta-johns back. So he was there about a week and a half or so longer than I was. Mm-hmm. But once the family members were on their way home, then my job in that disaster was finished.
I did want to ask about the international families. There were 3 passengers on the plane who were not U.S. citizens. And so I know that some of these family members did arrive, eventually were flown into the area, and they were at Seven Springs. Do you recall, did you have any interaction with the Japanese family or the German family? Alan Bevan's family, his birth family was from New Zealand. I'm not sure if any of them actually traveled, but...
I don't remember. Mm-hmm. And they may have come in long after we not totally closed the operation down, but there weren't enough family members to need somebody there 24/7. And I think at that point then the nursing officer handled it. Because I don't remember the international ones.
Or...
No, I really don't.
Okay.
And I think I would have picked up, particularly someone from a different nationality, I would have picked up on them. Mm-hmm. And they may have been there, and in that many people,
yes,
it just may not have registered.
Of family members.
Yes. Oh, like I said, we had 5 buses. How many were on a school bus? That went out.
There were buses on the second.
Yeah. And there were family members who chose not to go out to the site. Yet,
you were not able to attend the second service that was held for them either?
No. No. I missed both of the services. I regret that now, but at the time, you make your decisions based on what you think is going to be the best. And like I said, because I had local nurses who were volunteering, I felt that they would appreciate the memorial services even more. I mean, I would have appreciated it, but I think to them it would have meant more. And having talked to some of them afterward, it did. So those were the nurses I felt needed to go out to the site.
And in terms of the family members, after they went out, of course, for them, this was the first opportunity to view the site. They stood on that overlook that you described on September 11 at that became the FBI command post. But
at that point, it was PBS building.
Yes, looking down at the site, and then they were taken to Indian Lake where they had a memorial service. Do you have any memories of the family's reactions or their after the services, when they returned from those services?
When they came back, it was their affect that you noticed most, because they were all much quieter and much more withdrawn. It was like watching this experience replaying itself in their minds, and the fact that they had finally seen where their family members had ended up. And some of them would be there forever. And I know it was just this year, last year, that the coroner finally released the last 3 coffins full of body parts.
Last September.
That
Yes.
they never did identify those.
Those were the unidentified remains.
And yet I think, I'm not really sure, because you get away from it once you leave, but I think they finally identified parts of everyone, didn't they?
Yes, they did. Everyone was identified.
Wally did an outstanding job. He was, and he was good to work
Did you
with.
have interaction with him? I know you did go to the Family Assistance Center.
He came out there, but most of my interaction with him was that first day down at the site.
Okay.
That's where I got to meet him. I didn't know him before that. I was from Johnstown, heaven's sakes. I wasn't from Somerset. But just the way he handled things that very, very first day.
Your first impression was?
He was in charge. He was in charge of his aspect and what he needed to do. And he was not belligerent. He was not pushy. But nobody was going to tell him what to do with what he needed. And then, of course, he set up the DNA testing, along with the federal agencies. And, that crash, there were pieces of it for 10, 12 miles. And every bit of that had to be under his control, so that in case there were body parts, as I recall, the largest part of the plane they found was maybe 6 feet long.
That's correct.
Unbelievable. But I was just very impressed with him. I was impressed with him each time I ran into him. And he was out at the Vigilante Memorial for them. He was there for the family members, too. They knew who he was. And they knew what his job was.
The family members, I think, on the whole, hold him in high regard.
I think everybody did. I think, and rightfully so. He just did a great job. A thought just went through my mind, and then I lost it.
Well, maybe it will come back.
Granted, afterward, that the fences that were out there were loaded and loaded and loaded with pictures and mementos and flowers. And the first time we went out after it was over and I saw those, I was not as impressed as I was with the ones that came in the beginning while the family members were there. And people were doing things for the family members. They were sending them flowers, the pictures, and so on. It's just, and that's why I think a memorial is absolutely necessary. First, there's no place to put these 3 coffins except there. Oh, there are other places where they could have been put, but that's where they should be. Those people gave their lives. I mean, look at what could have happened if they hadn't done that.
And was there conversation about that at the Family Assistance Center? Were families sharing anything about these calls that many of them had received? We know now there were 37 calls placed from the aircraft. So the passengers and crew were calling their loved ones, friends.
There was not much conversation about that at the Family Assistance Center.
When did you become aware that?
It wasn't until later, really when it hit the news.
Through the media you learned more?
I learned more of it then. When they would come into the Family Assistance Center, they tended, if they were other family members or other families, they tended to sit off in a corner by themselves, or they were very quiet when they came in. It was not a room where there was a lot of open conversation. You know, we were there to support them, not to get in their way. So there were a lot of conversations we didn't hear. And we deliberately stayed out of their way. You know, if they wanted us or they looked our way or made motions, you know, we would go see what they wanted. But other than that, you know, they read the cards that came with the flowers. You know, they cried some, but it was very private, and that's what the room was intended to be. It was their family assistance center for them, not for anybody to intrude on them.
So you really learned more about the final moments of the flight through the media reports.
After the fact.
And your thoughts about what happened on the aircraft?
You know, I would never, ever have thought about the cell phone conversations. And of course, then when the movie came out.
The United 93, the one that was in the theaters?
Yes. No, I'm thinking about the one on television.
Okay, it has been on television
yeah.
now. Yeah.
It was a while after.
Mm-hmm. Have you seen
the
film?
Those wives who got phone calls from their husbands, literally saying, and they did, they said goodbye. Had to have been horrible. Had to have been just so traumatic for those family members who got the phone calls. You know, knowing that, indeed, they were, and those people in the plane with the cell phones, they knew they were never going to survive. It was indeed goodbye. And I think about how I would have felt had I gotten a phone call like that. It would just have been so traumatic. But no, at the time, they didn't talk about it. If they did, they talked among themselves. And again, we were there to give them their privacy. That was their room. But it was through the media I found out about the phone call. And I just thought that was amazing. Thought it was absolutely amazing.
And of course...
you know, did anybody profit from it when I don't think they should have? No, I think it was something that needed to come out. Mm-hmm. That needed to be publicly known. And like I say, some of them are still going on, raising their families, doing whatever. Some of them I know have remarried. But it's been 11 years. You have to live your life. I think they will always have a love in their heart for those they lost, but you have to live your life too. And that's what those family members are doing.
And I would assume from what you've shared that you have had an opportunity now to visit the permanent memorial that's been built.
Yes.
Okay.
And we were also at the chapel. The chapel's another thing I think they should leave alone.
Well, I really can't speak. You're welcome to speak to that, but
I know you can't.
Not affiliated with the National Park.
I know. They're two separate things.
Yes, entirely separate.
But I saw the picture of the paper of what they want to put there. It's a white clapboard chapel with a steeple. It's to me, it's the epitome of the United States, of the religion in the United States, with the garden behind it. I belong to the Somerset Garden Club. We've been very instrumental in the rose gardens.
That's also a separate.
That's a separate project.
Remember Me Rose Garden.
Yeah, those are all separate from the National Park Service and the memorial. So we have been out. It's time to go out again, since they've done a little bit more. But yes, I think there should be a memorial there. You know, not having thought about it as much in depth for 10 years at least, I kind of wonder what some of those family members are doing now. Mm-hmm. And now that you bring up names and then I can put them with their faces, I think I've thought about that a little bit. but just, what are they doing this many years after? Some of them are very, very active in working with the National Park Service.
Yes, they continue to be involved.
I think some of them don't want to be involved at all.
That is true.
They just want to go on with their lives and finish raising their children. Maybe remarry, relocate, do whatever, but they don't want to be involved in it. It's time for them to let it go. And I do believe there's a time when it's time for everybody to publicly let it go and let it become and remain the memorial. Do you have any other questions?
I just wanted to ask if you could tell me how this experience impacted you in terms of perhaps your ties with the Red Cross, your volunteerism. You did say this was the last.
That was the last
time
disaster that I went out on.
Mm-hmm.
But I continued to work per diem for the chapter. And again, I've been away from it for a while now, so I don't know. 93 is when I left the blood services. But I continued to work with the chapter, not the blood service. At that time, for the Certified Nurse Assistant program in the state of Pennsylvania, the Red Cross had the certification to do the testing, evaluation, whatever you want to call it. We didn't teach the classes. Those were done usually at either the VOTEC schools or some of the long-term care facilities.
Yes, I believe the way it is today still.
And Red Cross did the testing on it or the
certification.
evaluation on it. And I continued to do that just on a per diem basis, a couple times a month, 3 or 4, 5 times a month sometimes. So I stayed with that aspect of it for a while afterward, several years.
But not really disaster services.
Not disaster services, no. That became my last disaster. And it just was time for me to go on to other things.
And the personal impact of your experience at this particular response?
You mean with the...
Did it change your the way you live your life, or have any sort of lasting impact on your views about, any of the issues related to 9/11?
I think any of the issues I have already spoken.
Okay.
My admiration for some of the family members. If I have an issue with any family member, it's not a direct family member. It was those who were, like second and third cousins who came out of the woodwork. In fact, we had one family member who said, "I don't know who that is." Yeah, well, it's supposed to be your cousin. But the more immediate family members, I didn't have any issues with them other than feeling so deeply for them.
Yeah, I understand.
But there was just...
It's good you had John Weaver to talk with and
I needed John.
with.
I needed John that day when I finally realized I was going to break down.
I sometimes ask people who were part of the response if they had an opportunity to debrief, officially debrief.
In Red Cross, everybody's supposed to debrief before they leave the job. That was standard. So some people chose not to. But yes, the opportunity was there. And I had that issue, or that session with John, and then I debriefed some more at the end. But I think I left there without any major issues that I had to deal with. I got over my personal one issue. And it was just time for me not to do disaster anymore. And yet I still look at what's going on and have a major amount of guilt.
Oh.
Because, I'm not there. I wasn't there for Katrina. I wasn't there for a lot of the other ones. And that's never going to go away.
You've served a long, long time now, 25 years.
But that's still never going to go away. There's a time to quit, and there's a time to continue, and it was just time for me to quit.
How do you think Flight 93 will be remembered?
Unfortunately, I think it's going to fade from a lot of memories other than the local people and the family members who are surviving. It's not going to become a major memory like New York. I think Washington, D.C. and the Pentagon is going to fade dramatically. Because the emphasis, when you say ground zero, everybody says New York. Well, that wasn't my ground zero. That wasn't your ground zero.
No.
So I think it's going to become, for the next generation, a lost memory.
Is there anything else that you would like to add to this recording?
No, I don't think so. I think I covered most of it. I may think of something tomorrow, but
Well, I would like to thank you for meeting with me this afternoon, for recording in your own words your memories of this experience. Thank you.
I thank you for doing all this. Because like I say, I think a lot of memories are going to fade.
Well, the project may keep them alive. I don't know.